There are places in this country where the past refuses to stay buried, where old wounds never fully heal, and where the shadows of unsolved crimes still haunt the descendants of those who lived through them. Tonight, we journey to towns and cities across America that were once held hostage by fear, by killers who struck from the darkness and vanished without a trace. These are stories of communities that locked their doors, loaded their guns, and prayed for dawn. And in most cases, justice never came. So settle in, relax, and let me take you through the chilling histories of towns terrorized by unknown killers who were never caught. The spring of 1946 was supposed to be a time of healing for America. World War II had just ended. Soldiers were coming home, and communities across the nation were beginning to rebuild their lives. But in a small border town straddling Texas and Arkansas, something sinister was stirring. Texarkana, a modest community of about 40,000 people, was about to experience a reign of terror that would forever change the way its residents viewed the night. Texarkana was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody, where neighbors waved to each other from their porches and young couples cruised the quiet back roads on weekend evenings, looking for a quiet place to park and enjoy each other's company. The town's name came from its unique geography, sitting right on the border between Texas and Arkansas, with State Line Avenue running directly through its heart. On one side, you were in Texas, on the other, Arkansas. It was a close-knit community, a place where violent crime was rare, and the idea of a serial killer was something you read about in detective magazines, not something that happened in your own backyard. But that sense of security was about to be shattered. It was late on the night of February 22, 1946, when 25-year-old Jimmy Hollis and his 19-year-old girlfriend, Mary Jean LeRae, decided to park their car on a secluded road just outside of town. They had been to the movies earlier that evening and were enjoying each other's company, the way young couples often did in that era, when a figure emerged from the darkness. The man approached their car with a flashlight in one hand and a pistol in the other. His face was concealed by what witnesses would later describe as a burlap sack or white mask with crude holes cut out for his eyes and mouth. He ordered Jimmy out of the car first, and when the young man complied, the attacker struck him repeatedly with the butt of his pistol, fracturing his skull in 2 places. Jimmy crumpled to the ground, blood pooling beneath his head. Mary Jean watched in horror as the masked figure then turned his attention to her. He ordered her to run, and when she did, he caught up to her and subjected her to a brutal sexual assault using the barrel of his pistol. Throughout the attack, Mary Jean reportedly told her assailant to just kill her and get it over with. Something about her words seemed to unsettle him, and he suddenly fled into the night, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. Both Jimmy and Mary Jean survived their ordeal. They were able to provide police with descriptions of their attacker, though the details were maddeningly vague. He was about 6 feet tall, they said. He wore some kind of mask. Beyond that, they could offer little. The darkness had hidden too much, and the trauma of the attack had blurred the rest. Local authorities investigated the assault, but with few leads and both victims still alive, the case didn't generate significant attention. It was treated as an isolated incident, perhaps the work of a disturbed individual who had since moved on. Life in Texarkana continued much as it had before, with most residents unaware that this was only the beginning. Exactly 1 month later, on March 24, 1946, a passing motorist discovered a car parked on another secluded road about a mile outside of town. Inside the vehicle, he found the bodies of 29-year-old Richard Griffin and his 17-year-old girlfriend, Polly Ann Moore. Both had been shot in the back of the head with a .32 caliber pistol. The crime scene told a disturbing story. Bloodstains on the ground suggested that both victims had been killed outside the car and then placed back inside. Griffin was found positioned between the front seats, kneeling with his head resting on his crossed hands, almost as if he had been posed that way. Moore was face down in the back seat, her body arranged with unsettling precision. Neither victim had been sexually assaulted, and robbery appeared to have been ruled out since their belongings remained undisturbed. The investigation was hampered from the start. Heavy rain the night before had washed away any potential footprints or tire tracks, and the crime scene had been inadvertently contaminated by curious onlookers and even some law enforcement officers who had walked through the area before it could be properly secured. A single .32 caliber cartridge was found at the scene, but it offered little in the way of identifying the killer. Police were troubled by the similarities to the Hollis-LeRae attack a month earlier, but they stopped short of publicly linking the two incidents. The earlier victims had survived, after all, and no weapon had been fired. The possibility that a serial predator was hunting young couples in Texarkana seemed too far-fetched to consider seriously. That illusion was shattered 3 weeks later. On the night of April 13, 1946, 16-year-old Paul Martin drove to the Veterans of Foreign Wars building in downtown Texarkana to attend a dance. His friend, 15-year-old Betty Jo Booker, was performing there with a local band called the Rhythmaires, playing alto saxophone. Betty Jo was a talented musician, a popular high school junior who had won numerous scholastic and musical awards. She had been crowned Little Miss Texarkana as a child and was known throughout the community for her bright smile and kind heart. Paul Martin had traveled nearly 100 miles from his home in Kilgore, Texas, to see his childhood friend. His mother had worried about him making the trip, but Paul had insisted. The two teenagers had known each other since kindergarten, and though it was unclear whether their relationship was romantic, they clearly enjoyed each other's company. The dance ended well after midnight, and witnesses saw Paul and Betty Jo leave together around 2 in the morning. They climbed into Paul's 1946 Ford and drove off into the night. Neither of them was ever seen alive again. When Betty Jo failed to return home the next morning, her mother grew frantic. Search parties were organized, and by midday, volunteers were combing the outskirts of town. Paul Martin's body was discovered first, around 6:30 in the morning, lying on the side of North Park Road. He had been shot 4 times, once through the nose, once through the ribs from behind, once through his right hand, and once through the back of the neck. Blood was found further down the road by a fence, suggesting he had been attacked in one location and then moved. The search for Betty Jo continued for another 5 hours. Her body was found almost 2 miles from Paul's, concealed behind a tree in a wooded area. She had been shot twice, once through the chest and once in the face. Unlike Paul, Betty Jo showed signs of sexual assault. Official reports later confirmed that she had been raped before being killed. The weapon used in the murders was the same .32 caliber Colt automatic that had killed Griffin and Moore 3 weeks earlier. Ballistic evidence now irrefutably linked the 3 attacks, and police could no longer deny the obvious. They had a serial killer on their hands. The revelation sparked immediate panic throughout Texarkana. For the first time, residents began to understand that a predator was stalking their community, targeting young couples in isolated locations with ruthless efficiency. The killer seemed to know the area intimately, able to strike and vanish without leaving a trace, and he appeared to be growing bolder with each attack. The news spread through the community like wildfire. Neighbors gathered on street corners to share what they had heard, each retelling adding new details, some accurate and some exaggerated. The telephone lines buzzed with worried conversations. Parents called their children home early, and those children, sensing the fear in their elders' voices, obeyed without argument. Local churches opened their doors for special services, offering prayers for the safety of the community and the capture of the killer. Ministers who had preached about sin in the abstract now found themselves confronting evil in its most concrete form. They struggled to explain how a good and just God could allow such things to happen, and their congregations struggled to find comfort in their words. The business community felt the impact almost immediately. Restaurants and bars that had once stayed open until late at night began closing at dusk. Movie theaters saw their evening attendance plummet as residents refused to leave their homes after dark. Hotels reported cancellations from travelers who had heard about the murders and decided to stay elsewhere. The local newspapers dubbed the unknown assailant the Phantom Killer, and the name stuck. The Texarkana Gazette ran daily updates on the investigation, feeding the public's appetite for information while simultaneously amplifying their terror. National news outlets picked up the story, sending reporters from across the country to cover what was being called one of the most baffling murder cases in American history. Residents armed themselves in record numbers. Gun shops sold out of pistols and ammunition. Hardware stores couldn't keep locks and chains in stock. Families who had never owned firearms suddenly had them in every room of their houses. Women refused to go out alone, even in broad daylight. Businesses closed early, their owners unwilling to stay open after dark. Young couples who had once enjoyed parking on secluded roads now stayed home, the romantic tradition of lovers' lanes tainted by the fear of what might be lurking in the shadows. The Phantom Killer had transformed Texarkana into a community under siege. Law enforcement agencies from across the region descended on the town. The Texas Rangers sent their most experienced investigators, including the legendary Manuel Lone Wolf Gonzalez, a charismatic and handsome lawman who had built his reputation by bringing outlaws to justice in some of the state's most remote and lawless areas. The Arkansas State Police contributed their resources, and even the FBI offered assistance. Despite the influx of manpower and expertise, the investigation went nowhere. The killer had left behind precious little evidence. Fingerprints found at the crime scenes matched no one in police records. The only witnesses who had seen the attacker had been too traumatized and the night too dark to provide useful descriptions. Tips flooded in from frightened citizens, but most led to dead ends. Then, on May 3rd, 1946, the Phantom struck again, this time in a location that caught everyone off guard. Virgil Starks was a 37-year-old farmer who lived with his wife, Katie, in an isolated farmhouse northeast of Texarkana, on the Arkansas side of the border. Unlike the previous victims, the Starks were not young lovers parked on a remote road. They were a middle-aged married couple, safely inside their own home. Around 9 o'clock in the evening, Virgil was sitting in his living room reading the newspaper. Katie was in another room, listening to the radio. Without warning, 2 shots rang out from outside the window. The bullet struck Virgil in the back of the head, killing him instantly. Katie heard the shots and rushed to find her husband slumped over in his chair, blood pooling on the floor. As she turned toward the window, more shots were fired. 2 bullets struck her in the face. One passed through her right cheek and exited behind her left ear, while the other shattered her jaw and lodged under her tongue. Despite her devastating injuries, Katie somehow remained conscious. She stumbled through the house, trying to reach the telephone to call for help. The killer, apparently not satisfied that his work was done, attempted to enter the house. Katie later reported hearing footsteps on the porch and someone trying to open the door. Bleeding profusely and barely able to see, she made her way out the back of the house and staggered across a field to her nearest neighbor's home, nearly half a mile away. When police arrived at the Starks' farmhouse, they found Virgil dead in his chair. A blood trail led from the living room through the house, marking Katie's desperate escape. Outside the window where the shots had been fired, investigators found a flashlight that had apparently been left behind by the killer. It was a distinctive 2-cell metal flashlight with both ends painted red, and police hoped it might finally provide the clue they needed to identify the Phantom. The flashlight was widely publicized, with newspapers running detailed descriptions and urging anyone who recognized it to come forward. But despite the publicity, no one ever identified the owner. The flashlight, like the Phantom himself, seemed to have materialized out of thin air. Katie Stark survived her injuries, though she was left permanently scarred. She was able to provide some details about the attack, but like the other survivors, she had never gotten a clear look at her attacker. The darkness and the sudden violence had robbed her of the opportunity to identify the man who had killed her husband and nearly killed her. The Starks' attack marked a significant departure from the killer's previous crimes. The victims had not been young lovers, and they had been attacked in their own home rather than in a parked car on a remote road. Some investigators questioned whether the Stark shooting was even related to the earlier murders. But the timing and the geographic proximity to the other crimes made it impossible to dismiss the connection entirely. By the summer of 1946, Texarkana had become a ghost town after dark. Streets that had once been filled with people enjoying the warm evening air were now deserted. The phrase "dreading sundown" entered the local vocabulary, and it would later become the title of a film based on the murders. Residents lived in a state of constant anxiety, never knowing when or where the Phantom might strike next. But as suddenly as the terror had begun, it ended. After the Starks' attack on May 3rd, there were no more killings that could definitively be attributed to the Phantom. The summer passed, then the fall, then the winter, and still no new attacks. Some residents dared to hope that the nightmare was finally over. Others feared that the killer was simply biding his time, waiting for the heightened security to relax before striking again. The investigation continued, though with diminishing intensity. Police had interviewed thousands of people and followed hundreds of leads, but they were no closer to identifying the killer than they had been on the night of the first attack. The case began to go cold, overshadowed by other news and other crimes. Then, in July 1946, a break seemed to come. A young woman named Peggy Swinney came to the attention of police after she was found in possession of a car that had been stolen on the night of the Griffin Moore murders. Under questioning, Peggy eventually revealed that her husband, Ewell Swinney, had been responsible for the Texarkana murders. She provided detailed accounts of the killings, including information that had never been released to the public, which appeared to corroborate her claims. Ewell Swinney was a career criminal with a history of car theft, burglary, counterfeiting, and assault. He was known to frequent the areas where the attacks had occurred, and he matched the general physical description provided by the surviving victims. Police were convinced that they had finally found the Phantom Killer. But there was a problem. Under the law at the time, a wife could not be compelled to testify against her husband. Without Peggy's testimony, prosecutors had no evidence that directly linked Ewell to the murders. The statements she had given to police were inadmissible in court. Rather than let Swinney walk free, prosecutors took a different approach. They charged him with car theft, and because of his extensive criminal history, he was designated a habitual offender and sentenced to life in prison. It was a creative solution to an impossible situation, ensuring that even if Swinney was the Phantom Killer, he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. But the question of whether Ewell Swinney truly was the Phantom has never been definitively answered. He never confessed to the murders, and no physical evidence was ever found linking him to the crimes. Some investigators who worked the case went to their graves convinced of his guilt. Others remained skeptical, pointing out the holes in the case and the possibility that Peggy had fabricated her accusations for reasons of her own. Swinney was released from prison in 1974 after a court ruling invalidated one of his prior convictions that had been used to enhance his sentence. He lived quietly in the Dallas area until his death in 1994, never publicly discussing the Texarkana murders. The case remains officially unsolved to this day. The passage of more than 7 decades has not brought closure to the families of the victims or to the community that was terrorized by the Phantom Killer. Every so often, someone comes forward claiming to know the identity of the killer, but nothing has ever been proven. The summer of 1946 passed in a haze of fear and uncertainty. Every unexplained noise became a potential threat. Every stranger who passed through town was regarded with suspicion. Businesses that had once stayed open until late at night now closed their doors at dusk, their owners unwilling to risk becoming the next victim. Churches held special prayer services, asking for divine protection from the evil that seemed to have taken root in their community. The psychological toll on Texarkana was immense. Children who had once played freely in their neighborhoods were now kept inside after dark. Mothers who had sent their daughters to the movies without a second thought now refused to let them leave the house alone. The trust that had bound the community together was fraying, replaced by a pervasive sense of vulnerability that would take years to fade. Law enforcement, too, was deeply affected by the case. The officers who had worked the investigation were haunted by their inability to catch the killer. Some continued to pursue leads on their own time, long after they had officially retired from the force. Others tried to put the case behind them, only to find that the memories refused to stay buried. Manuel Gonzalez, the legendary Texas Ranger who had been brought in to solve the case, eventually left Texarkana without the resolution he had sought. His reputation, built on decades of successful investigations, was tarnished by his failure to apprehend the Phantom. He would spend the rest of his career defending his handling of the case, arguing that he had been hamstrung by jurisdictional issues and limited resources. The community itself struggled to move forward. Some residents left Texarkana entirely, unable to shake the feeling that the killer might still be among them. Others stayed but remained vigilant, their lives forever altered by the events of that terrible spring. For years afterward, any crime that occurred in the area was scrutinized for possible connections to the Phantom, as if the specter of the killer might return at any moment to resume his reign of terror. In the decades since the murders, numerous theories have emerged about the identity of the Phantom Killer. Some researchers have suggested that the killer might have been a railroad worker, someone who traveled frequently and could have committed similar crimes in other cities. Others have proposed that the Phantom was a local resident, someone who knew the area intimately and could blend into the community without attracting suspicion. The theory that Ewell Swinney was the killer has gained the most traction over the years, supported by the detailed confession his wife provided to police. But even this theory has its problems. Peggy Swinney's statements were inconsistent at times, and she had her own legal troubles that might have motivated her to cooperate with investigators. Without physical evidence or a confession from Swinney himself, the question of his guilt remains open. What happened in Texarkana in the spring of 1946 would go on to influence American culture in ways that few could have predicted. The case is credited by some as the inspiration for the urban legend of the Hookman, the story of a young couple who narrowly escapes a killer with a hook for a hand. The 1976 film, The Town That Dreaded Sundown, dramatized the events, cementing the Phantom Killer in the pantheon of American serial killers. But for those who lived through it, the terror was all too real. To this day, older residents of Texarkana remember the fear that gripped their community, the way their parents locked the doors at night and kept guns close at hand. The Phantom Killer may never have been caught, but his legacy lives on in the collective memory of a town that once dreaded the setting of the sun. The decade before the Phantom terrorized Texarkana, another American city was grappling with its own nightmare, one that was arguably even more gruesome and far-reaching in its horror. Cleveland, Ohio, in the 1930s was a city of stark contrasts. On one hand, it was a thriving industrial center, home to major steel mills and manufacturing plants that employed tens of thousands of workers. On the other, the Great Depression had created pockets of desperate poverty, where the unemployed and the homeless congregated in makeshift shantytowns, surviving on whatever they could scrounge or steal. One such area was known as Kingsbury Run, a prehistoric creek bed that cut through the city's east side, providing shelter to hundreds of transients who had fallen through society's cracks. It was in this grim landscape that one of America's most prolific and mysterious serial killers began his reign of terror. The nightmare began on September 23, 1935, when two young boys stumbled upon a gruesome discovery while playing at the bottom of Jackass Hill, a steep embankment overlooking Kingsbury Run. What they found would haunt Cleveland for years to come: the naked, decapitated bodies of two men, their heads buried separately nearby. Both had been emasculated, their genitals placed near the severed heads in what appeared to be a deliberate arrangement. One of the victims was eventually identified as Edward Andraschi, a 29-year-old man with a troubled past who had once worked as an orderly in the psychiatric ward of Cleveland City Hospital. The other man was never identified, despite extensive efforts by police. Autopsies revealed that both men had been decapitated while still alive, their deaths caused by the severing of their spinal cords. The precision of the cuts suggested someone with medical knowledge, perhaps a surgeon or butcher, who knew exactly how to dismember a human body. The discovery at Jackass Hill was horrifying enough on its own, but it would prove to be just the beginning. Over the next 3 years, more bodies would surface in and around Kingsbury Run, each one bearing the same grisly signature: decapitation, dismemberment, and in many cases, emasculation. The killer seemed to have a particular method, draining his victims of blood and scrubbing their bodies clean before disposing of them. In most cases, the heads were never found, making identification impossible. The press dubbed the unknown killer the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, though he was also known as the Cleveland Torso Murderer due to the dismembered state of his victims. The crime sent waves of fear through the city, particularly among the vulnerable populations that lived in the shantytowns along the run. As the body count mounted, pressure grew on city officials to solve the case. In 1935, Cleveland had elected Harold Burton as mayor on a platform of reform, and Burton had brought in a young, ambitious safety director to clean up the city's notoriously corrupt police department. That safety director's name was Eliot Ness, fresh from his legendary battles against Al Capone and the Chicago mob as part of the Untouchables. Ness threw himself into the torso murder investigation with characteristic determination. He recruited additional detectives to work the case full-time, including Peter Marilow and Martin Zalewski, who would spend years tracking the Mad Butcher through Cleveland's underworld. Ness also organized a torso clinic, bringing together police officials, medical examiners, psychiatrists, and other experts to analyze the evidence and create a profile of the killer. But despite these efforts, the murders continued. In January 1936, the upper half of a woman's torso was found near Central Avenue, the rest of her body scattered across the surrounding area. She was eventually identified as Florence Polillo, a 41-year-old woman who frequented the bars and rooming houses of Cleveland's roaring 3rd Precinct. Her head was never recovered. 4 months later, 2 boys discovered a severed head wrapped in a pair of pants beneath the Kingsbury Run Bridge. The headless, emasculated body of a young man was found nearby, tattoos covering his arms and chest. Despite the distinctive markings, which included the names Helen and Paul, and the initials WCG, the victim was never identified. Police created a plaster cast of his head, displaying it at the Great Lakes Exposition in hopes that someone among the more than 100,000 visitors might recognize him. No one did. The murders continued through 1936 and into 1937, with bodies turning up in ravines, vacant lots, and the oily waters of the Cuyahoga River. The killer seemed to operate with impunity, leaving behind nothing but the butchered remains of his victims. He varied his dumping grounds, making it impossible for police to predict where the next body might surface. The brutality of the crimes was difficult to comprehend. Each victim had been decapitated with surgical precision, the cuts made cleanly through the vertebrae in a way that suggested extensive anatomical knowledge. In many cases, the bodies had been drained of blood before being dismembered, indicating that the killer had access to facilities where such grisly work could be performed without detection. The choice of victims seemed deliberate as well. Most were transients or individuals living on the margins of society, people whose absence might not be noticed for days or even weeks. The killer appeared to understand that by targeting the powerless, he reduced the chances of a thorough investigation. Dead vagrants did not generate the same outcry as murdered socialites. But the psychological impact on Cleveland was severe nonetheless. The city's residents lived in fear, wondering who might be next. Women refused to walk alone at night. Men who worked late shifts traveled in groups. The homeless population of Kingsbury Run, already living in desperate circumstances, now faced the added terror of knowing that a killer was stalking their community. The press coverage was relentless. Cleveland's 3 major newspapers competed to provide the most lurid details of each new discovery, feeding the public's appetite for horror while simultaneously amplifying their anxiety. Headlines screamed about the Mad Butcher and the torso murderer, turning the unknown killer into a mythic figure of evil. Eliot Ness, who had built his reputation by taking down some of Chicago's most powerful gangsters, found himself facing an adversary unlike any he had encountered before. Organized crime operated according to rules that could be understood and exploited. The torso murderer operated according to no rules at all, killing for reasons that remained utterly opaque. The citizens of Cleveland grew increasingly fearful and frustrated. The police seemed powerless to stop the carnage, and each new discovery only deepened the sense of dread that had settled over the city. The Mad Butcher had become a boogeyman, a shadowy figure who could strike anyone, anywhere, at any time. By 1938, Eliot Ness was desperate for a break in the case. His reputation, built on his success against organized crime in Chicago, was now being tarnished by his inability to catch a single killer. The press had grown critical, and the public was demanding answers that Ness could not provide. In August 1938, the bodies of 2 more victims were found at a dump at the end of East 9th Street. Like the others, they had been decapitated and dismembered. Unlike the others, these victims were found within sight of the windows of Eliot Ness's own office in City Hall. It was as if the killer was taunting him, daring him to make an arrest. Days after the discovery, Ness took a drastic step. On the night of August 18th, he ordered a massive raid on the shantytown of Kingsbury Run. Police officers descended on the makeshift dwellings, arresting everyone they found and torching the shacks and lean-tos that had provided shelter to the area's homeless population. Over 300 people were displaced, their meager possessions reduced to ashes. The raid was controversial then, and remains so today. Critics accused Ness of punishing the victims rather than catching the killer, of clearing out an eyesore rather than solving the crimes. Supporters argued that by eliminating the shantytown, Ness had deprived the killer of his hunting ground, a place where vulnerable people gathered with no one to notice or report their disappearance. Whatever the merits of the raid, it seemed to work. After August 1938, no more bodies were officially attributed to the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. The killing spree that had claimed at least 12 lives, and possibly many more, appeared to be over. But the question remained, who was the Mad Butcher? Ness believed he knew the answer. During the investigation, suspicion had fallen on a man named Francis Sweeney, a physician and the first cousin of Congressman Martin Sweeney, one of Ness's political enemies. Francis Sweeney was an alcoholic with a history of mental instability, and critically, the medical training necessary to perform the precise dismemberments that characterized the torso murders. In August 1938, shortly before the raid on Kingsbury Run, Ness had Sweeney brought in for questioning. The interrogation lasted for days, conducted in secret at a downtown hotel. Sweeney was reportedly administered a lie detector test, which he failed repeatedly when asked about the murders. But he never confessed, and without a confession or physical evidence, Ness could not arrest him. Whether because of the investigation's intensity or for other reasons, Francis Sweeney checked himself into a psychiatric institution shortly after the interrogation. He would spend the rest of his life in and out of mental facilities, dying in 1964 without ever being charged with the torso murders. But he apparently never forgot about Eliot Ness. For years after the interrogation, Sweeney sent taunting postcards to the former safety director, many of them signed with cryptic references that seemed to acknowledge his guilt without ever explicitly admitting anything. The Cleveland torso murders remain officially unsolved. The passage of nearly 90 years has not provided the answers that investigators sought, and most of the potential suspects, including Francis Sweeney, have long since died. But the case continues to fascinate amateur sleuths and professional criminologists alike, a reminder of a time when a single killer could terrorize one of America's largest cities and never face justice for his crimes. In 2024, authorities announced a new effort to identify some of the unknown victims using DNA technology that did not exist during the original investigation. Whether this effort will finally bring closure to one of America's oldest cold cases remains to be seen. Before Cleveland's Mad Butcher, before the Phantom of Texarkana, there was another American city that experienced a similar reign of terror, one that predates even the infamous Jack the Ripper by several years. In the mid-1880s, Austin, Texas, was a city on the rise. The state capital had been transformed from a sleepy frontier town into a bustling center of commerce and politics. New buildings were going up all over town, including the magnificent new state capitol, which was then under construction and would eventually become the largest such building in the nation. Railroads connected Austin to the rest of the country, bringing new residents, new businesses, and new opportunities. But in the shadows of this progress, something dark was stirring. The terror began on the final night of 1884. Molly Smith was a 25-year-old black woman who worked as a domestic servant for a prominent Austin family. She lived in a small cabin behind the main house with her boyfriend, Walter Spencer. Sometime during the night of December 30th, 1884, an intruder entered their cabin, attacked Walter with a weapon, and dragged Molly outside into the yard. Molly's employer found her body the next morning. She had been beaten repeatedly with a blunt object, her head nearly crushed by the force of the blows. Her body bore signs of a brutal sexual assault. An ice pick or similar implement had been driven into each of her ears, a grotesque detail that would become a signature of the crimes to come. Walter Spencer, despite his severe injuries, survived the attack, but could provide no useful description of the assailant. The murder shocked Austin's African-American community, but it received relatively little attention from the wider public or the press. Molly Smith was a black servant girl in the Jim Crow South, and crimes against such victims often went uninvestigated or were attributed to domestic disputes and other mundane causes. But the killer was not finished. 3 months later, on the night of March 19, 1885, 2 Swedish immigrant women were attacked in their quarters behind another wealthy Austin home. Clara Strand and Christine Martinson were both seriously wounded, but survived. Like Molly Smith, they had been attacked in their beds by an unknown intruder who had slipped into their room undetected. The pattern continued through the spring and summer of 1885. On May 6th, Eliza Shelley was found murdered in her cabin, her skull crushed and her body mutilated. On May 22nd, Irene Cross became the next victim, killed with what appeared to be a combination of blunt force trauma and stabbing wounds. In August, 11-year-old Mary Ramey was killed, the youngest victim yet. Her mother, Rebecca, was attacked but survived. Then, on September 28th, a young black couple, Gracie Vance and her boyfriend, Orange Washington, were both murdered in the quarters behind the home where Gracie worked. By late 1885, Austin was in the grip of genuine terror. The killer seemed to operate with impunity, striking at will and disappearing into the night. His victims were primarily black women who worked as domestic servants, hence the name that would later be applied to the case, the Servant Girl Murders. But no one was truly safe. The killer had proven willing to attack anyone who got in his way, regardless of age or gender. The city's response was chaotic and often ineffective. The Austin Police Department of the 1880s was a far cry from modern law enforcement. Officers were poorly trained, poorly equipped, and operating without the benefit of forensic science or investigative techniques that would later become standard. There was no fingerprint analysis, no DNA testing, no psychological profiling. Investigators were essentially working blind, following leads that went nowhere and chasing suspects who turned out to be innocent. The investigation was further complicated by the racial dynamics of the era. Most of the early victims were black women, and in the post-Reconstruction South, crimes against African Americans often received less attention and fewer resources than crimes against whites. Some historians have argued that the Austin police might have caught the killer earlier if they had treated the first attacks with the urgency they deserved. Evidence collection at the crime scenes was primitive by modern standards. Officers trampled through crime scenes without regard for preserving footprints or other physical evidence. Blood samples were not systematically collected or analyzed. Potential witnesses were not interviewed with the rigor that modern detective work demands. Despite these limitations, investigators did notice some patterns. Several crime scenes showed evidence of bare footprints with an unusual characteristic. One foot appeared to be missing a toe. This detail was kept from the press in hopes that it might eventually help identify the killer. The weapon varied from attack to attack, suggesting that the killer used whatever was convenient rather than carrying a signature weapon. Axes, knives, and blunt objects were all employed at different times. The attacks shared certain characteristics that suggested a single perpetrator. They all occurred at night, under cover of darkness. The victims were all attacked in or near their beds, suggesting that the killer was able to enter homes undetected. And in several cases, sharp objects were inserted into the victim's ears after death, a gruesome signature that linked the crimes. The African American community, which bore the brunt of the attacks, developed its own theories about the killer. Some believed he was a white man with almost supernatural abilities, a monster who could appear and disappear at will, whose very presence seemed to silence the dogs that might otherwise have raised an alarm. Candles were lit in windows to ward off evil, and some families resorted to folk magic and voodoo rituals to protect themselves. Then, on Christmas Eve 1885, the nature of the crimes changed dramatically. That night, 2 white women were murdered in their own homes in separate attacks that occurred within hours of each other. Susan Hancock, a 40-year-old wife and mother, was found in the backyard of her modest home, her head nearly severed by a brutal axe blow. Less than a mile away, 17-year-old Eula Phillips was discovered in similar condition, killed in the bed she shared with her husband Jimmy, who had been wounded in the attack but survived. The murder of white women, especially one as young and seemingly innocent as Eula Phillips, transformed the servant girl murders from a local concern into a citywide crisis. The previous victims had been easy for the white establishment to overlook, but Susan Hancock and Eula Phillips were members of their own community, women who could have been their wives, their daughters, their sisters. Suddenly, the case received the attention it should have had from the beginning. Private detectives were hired, rewards were offered. The streets were patrolled by newly deputized citizens carrying firearms and instructions to shoot anyone who seemed suspicious. Austin, which had prided itself on being a progressive and civilized city, looked more like a frontier town under siege. Despite these efforts, the killer was never caught. Police arrested numerous suspects, including some who seemed highly plausible at the time. Jimmy Phillips, Eula's husband, was charged with her murder after investigators grew suspicious of his story. He was convicted and sentenced to 7 years in prison, but the conviction was later overturned and he was acquitted at a second trial. A man named Walter Spencer, the boyfriend of the first victim, Molly Smith, was also tried and acquitted. One suspect who attracted attention then and continues to do so today was Nathan Elgin, a 19-year-old African-American cook who worked at a hotel near many of the crime scenes. Elgin had a history of violent behavior and had once sent a threatening letter to a deputy sheriff. More significantly, he was missing a toe on one foot, and police had noted that some of the footprints found at the murder scenes appeared to have been made by someone with a similar deformity. In February 1886, just weeks after the last murders, Nathan Elgin was shot and killed by police as he attempted to assault a young woman with a knife. With his death, the servant girl murders ended. No more attacks occurred, and the case gradually faded from public consciousness. Whether Nathan Elgin was the killer remains a matter of debate. Some researchers believe that the circumstantial evidence against him is compelling, particularly the footprint evidence and the fact that the murders stopped after his death. Others point out that the evidence is far from conclusive and that many other suspects were never adequately investigated. The servant girl annihilator, as the killer came to be called, has never been definitively identified. The case predates modern forensic techniques, and the physical evidence that might have led to a solution has long since been lost or destroyed. What remains is one of America's earliest documented serial murder cases, a reminder that the horror of such crimes did not begin in the 20th century. Interestingly, some researchers have noted parallels between the Austin murders and the Jack the Ripper killings that occurred in London's Whitechapel district 3 years later. Both cases involve the brutal murder of women, often in their own beds, by a killer who struck at night and vanished without a trace. Some have even speculated that the two cases might be connected, that the Austin killer might have traveled to England and resumed his crimes there. There is no evidence to support this theory, but it speaks to the enduring fascination with both cases and the human need to find explanations for seemingly inexplicable evil. There is a scenic road in Virginia that winds for 23 miles through some of the most historically significant territory in America. The Colonial Parkway connects Jamestown, where English colonists first established a permanent settlement in the New World, to Yorktown, where George Washington's forces won the decisive battle of the American Revolution. In between lies Williamsburg, a meticulously preserved colonial town that draws millions of visitors each year. It is a beautiful drive, particularly in autumn when the leaves are turning, or in spring when the dogwoods are in bloom. The road passes through forests and marshes, alongside the York River, and past numerous scenic overlooks where travelers can stop and take in the views. For decades, it was a popular spot for young couples seeking privacy, a lover's lane hidden in plain sight along one of Virginia's most scenic corridors. But between 1986 and 1989, the Colonial Parkway became associated with something far darker than Revolutionary War history or romantic trysts. During those 4 years, 8 young people were murdered or disappeared along or near the parkway, their deaths linked by circumstances that suggested a single predator stalking the isolated roads. The nightmare began on October 9, 1986, when Kathleen Thomas and Rebecca Dowski vanished after leaving the campus of the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg. Thomas, 27, was a graduate of the United States Naval Academy and worked at a local security firm. Dowski, 21, was a senior at William and Mary, majoring in business management and working part-time as a stockbroker. The two women were in a romantic relationship. 3 days after their disappearance, a jogger discovered Thomas's white Honda Civic at the bottom of an embankment at the Cheatham Annex Overlook, about 7 miles east of Williamsburg. Inside the vehicle were the bodies of both women. They had been strangled, their throats slashed so deeply that they were nearly decapitated. The killer had doused their bodies and the car with diesel fuel, apparently intending to set them on fire, but for some reason had failed to ignite the blaze. No fingerprints were found that matched anyone in police records, and despite over 100 latent prints recovered from the vehicle, the killer remained unidentified. Almost a year later, on September 20th, 1987, 20-year-old David Knobling and 14-year-old Robin Edwards went missing after a night out with friends in Newport News. They had been attending a movie and visiting an arcade before driving to Ragged Island Wildlife Refuge, a remote spot on the south bank of the James River where young couples often went to be alone. Their bodies were found 3 days later at the refuge. Both had been shot in the head with a .38 caliber pistol. Like Thomas and Dowski, their bodies appeared to have been positioned deliberately, though in this case they were found in the open rather than inside a vehicle. David Knobling's pickup truck was discovered nearby, the keys still in the ignition. For a time, investigators were uncertain whether the Knobling-Edwards murders were connected to the Thomas Dowski case. The method of killing was different. The location was across the James River from the Colonial Parkway, and there was no apparent connection between the victims. But the pattern of targeting young couples in isolated locations along the Virginia waterfront was too striking to ignore. Then came the third incident. On April 10, 1988, Keith Call and Cassandra Haley disappeared after attending a college party in Newport News. Call, 20, and Haley, 18, were students at Christopher Newport University. It was only their first date, and they had met at the party and seemed to hit it off, leaving together around 1:30 in the morning to make Cassandra's curfew. The next morning, Keith's red Toyota Celica was found abandoned at the York River Overlook along the Colonial Parkway, less than a mile from where Thomas and Dowski had been discovered 18 months earlier. The car was unlocked, the keys still in the ignition. Both the driver's and passenger's side doors were open. Cassandra's high-heeled shoes were found inside the vehicle, suggesting she had been removed from the car rather than walking away voluntarily. But Keith and Cassandra were nowhere to be found. Extensive searches were conducted of the York River and the surrounding woodlands. Divers explored the murky waters, and volunteers combed through miles of dense underbrush. Dogs were brought in to search for scent trails. Helicopters surveyed the area from above, but no trace of the missing couple was ever found. Their bodies have never been recovered. To this day, Keith Call and Cassandra Haley remain missing, presumed dead at the hands of the same killer who had already claimed 4 lives. Their families have spent decades searching for answers, organizing searches, following leads, and pleading with the public for information. But the earth has kept its secrets. The disappearance of Keith and Cassandra represented a new escalation in the Colonial Parkway case. Previous victims had been killed and their bodies discovered, but Keith and Cassandra simply vanished, leaving behind only their abandoned car and a mystery that has never been solved. Some investigators believe their bodies were weighted and thrown into the York River, carried away by currents to rest in some undiscovered location. Others theorize that they were transported to a remote burial site, hidden so well that even decades of searching have failed to uncover them. Without bodies, without physical evidence, without witnesses, the investigation into their disappearance reached a dead end. For the families of Keith Call and Cassandra Haley, the uncertainty has been almost as painful as the loss itself. There is no grave to visit, no closure to be found. They exist in a state of perpetual limbo, unable to fully mourn loved ones whose fate remains unknown. The final confirmed attack in the Colonial Parkway murder series occurred on September 5, 1989. Anna Maria Phelps, 18, and Daniel Lauer, 21, had been driving from their home in Virginia Beach to pick up some of Lauer's belongings. Their vehicle, a gold 1972 Chevrolet Nova, was found abandoned at an Interstate 64 rest stop in New Kent County. The car was on the opposite side of the highway from where they would have been traveling, suggesting that something had caused them to pull over, or that someone had moved the vehicle after their disappearance. 6 weeks later, on October 19th, hunters discovered their decomposed remains in a wooded area about a mile from the rest stop. The bodies were wrapped in a blanket that had come from Lauer's car, suggesting that the killer had taken time to transport and conceal them. The advanced state of decomposition made it impossible to determine a precise cause of death. The Colonial Parkway murders spawned an extensive investigation involving local police departments, the Virginia State Police, the FBI, and the National Park Service, which had jurisdiction over the Colonial Parkway itself. Profilers from the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit developed profiles of the likely killer, suggesting that he was probably a white male in his 30s or 40s with an authoritative demeanor, possibly someone who presented himself as a law enforcement officer or security guard. This last detail seemed particularly significant. Several witnesses reported seeing a figure matching that description in the areas where the attacks occurred, and the fact that the victims appeared to have stopped willingly without signs of a struggle or forced entry into their vehicles suggested that they might have been approached by someone they believed was a legitimate authority figure. For decades, the Colonial Parkway murders remained one of the most baffling unsolved cases in Virginia history. Investigators pursued numerous suspects without success. The case appeared in countless television documentaries and true crime publications, but the publicity failed to generate the breakthrough that investigators hoped for. Then, in January 2024, Virginia State Police announced a startling development. Using advanced DNA analysis and genetic genealogy techniques, they had identified a suspect in the Nobbling Edwards murders, Alan Wade Wilmer, Sr., a fisherman from Virginia's Northern Neck region who had died in 2017. Wilmer's DNA had been matched to evidence collected from the Nobbling Edwards crime scene decades earlier. He was also linked through DNA to a third murder, that of Teresa Lynn Howell, a 29-year-old woman who was strangled and left at a construction site in Hampton in 1989. While the Howell murder had not previously been connected to the Colonial Parkway cases, investigators now believed it was the work of the same killer. The identification of Wilmer brought some closure to the families of David Nobbling and Robin Edwards, who had waited nearly 4 decades for answers. But it also raised new questions. Was Wilmer responsible for all of the Colonial Parkway murders, or just some of them? And if he was not responsible for the others, who was? As of now, investigators have not definitively linked Wilmer to the murders of Thomas and Dowski, or to the disappearance of Call and Haley, or to the deaths of Phelps and Lauer. The DNA evidence that connected him to the Nobbling Edwards case has not been found in connection with the other incidents. Some researchers believe that multiple killers may have been operating along the Virginia waterfront during those years, a troubling possibility that suggests the danger was even greater than anyone realized. The Colonial Parkway remains open to this day, its scenic vistas still drawing tourists and history buffs from around the world. But for those who remember the terror of the late 1980s, the road carries darker memories, reminders of a time when even the most beautiful places could harbor the most terrible evil. In the late 1980s, another community found itself terrorized by an unknown killer, this time in the working-class city of New Bedford, Massachusetts. New Bedford had once been one of the wealthiest cities in America, its fortune built on the whaling industry that had made it the whaling capital of the world in the 19th century. But by the 1980s, those glory days were long past. The fishing industry that had replaced whaling was in decline, and the city struggled with poverty, unemployment, and the social problems that accompany economic hardship. One of those problems was a thriving drug trade that had taken root in New Bedford streets. Cocaine and heroin were readily available, and many of those who became addicted turned to prostitution to support their habits. The Weld Square area of downtown New Bedford became notorious as a place where sex workers plied their trade, soliciting customers from cars that cruised the streets at all hours. It was from these streets that a killer began to select his victims. In the spring of 1988, women who worked as prostitutes in New Bedford began to disappear. At first, the disappearances attracted little attention. Sex workers and drug addicts often moved from place to place, and their absence was not always noted immediately, even by their families. But as the months passed and more women vanished, a pattern began to emerge. Detective Ida Lopez of the New Bedford Police Department was among the first to recognize that something sinister was happening. She had worked in the area for years and knew many of the women who frequented Weld Square. When they stopped showing up, she began to investigate, compiling a list of missing women who shared similar backgrounds: involvement in prostitution, struggles with drug addiction, connections to the same areas of New Bedford. The first body was discovered on July 3, 1988. Deborah Medeiros, a 30-year-old mother of 3, was found in the woods along Interstate 195 near Dartmouth. She had been strangled, her body positioned with her feet pointing toward the highway. It would become a signature of sorts, this deliberate placement of the victims where they could be seen from the road. 3 weeks later, on July 30th, the body of Nancy Paiva was found in a similar location along Interstate 195. Like Medeiros, Paiva had struggled with drug addiction and had worked the streets of Weld Square. She had been strangled, her nude body disposed of with the same clinical precision. Over the next 9 months, more bodies would be discovered along the highways surrounding New Bedford. Deborah DeMello, found in November 1988. Rochelle Clifford Dopiarala, found in December 1988. Robin Rhodes, found in March 1989. Mary Rose Santos, found in March 1989. Sandra Botelho, found in April 1989. Each had been strangled. Each had connections to the drug scene and sex work in New Bedford. Each had been discarded like refuse along the roadside. 2 more women, Christiane Montero and Marilyn Cardozo Roberts, disappeared during the same period, but have never been found. They are presumed to have been victims of the same killer, bringing the total to 11 women who vanished from New Bedford streets during those terrible months. The case became known as the New Bedford Highway Murders, and the unknown perpetrator was dubbed the Highway Killer. The FBI was called in to assist local law enforcement, and a task force was formed to coordinate the investigation. But despite these efforts, the killer remained at large. The victims of the New Bedford Highway Killer shared common circumstances that made them vulnerable. Almost all struggled with drug addiction, primarily to heroin and cocaine, substances that had flooded into the city during the crack epidemic of the 1980s. To support their habits, many had turned to prostitution, working the streets around Weld Square and accepting rides from strangers who cruised the neighborhood looking for services. This lifestyle made them easy targets. They were accustomed to getting into cars with unknown men, which meant that the killer could approach them without raising suspicion. Their drug use impaired their judgment and their ability to recognize danger, and their transient existence meant that their absence often went unnoticed for days or weeks, giving the killer time to dispose of their bodies without immediate pursuit. But the fact that these women lived difficult lives did not make their deaths any less tragic. They were human beings with families, with hopes, with stories that deserved to be told. Deborah Medeiros had 3 children who would grow up without their mother. Nancy Paiva was a daughter and a sister who was loved by those who knew her. Each of the victims left behind people who mourned them, people who still seek answers decades later. The investigation was hampered by the victims' circumstances. Because they were sex workers and drug users, they had few records of their movements. They didn't punch time clocks or check in with employers. They didn't have regular schedules that could be tracked. When they disappeared, there was no obvious moment to investigate, no last known location that could be identified with precision. Witnesses were equally difficult to find. The people who worked the streets of Weld Square had their own reasons for avoiding the police. Many feared arrest for prostitution or drug possession. Others simply didn't want to get involved in an investigation that might bring scrutiny to their own activities. The code of silence that prevailed in that community protected the killer as much as it protected anyone else. Investigators focused on several suspects. Anthony DeGrazia, a muscular stonemason, had been accused by at least 17 women of choking and assaulting sex workers in the New Bedford area during the late 1980s. He was indicted on multiple counts of rape and assault and seemed to match the profile of the killer. But before he could be conclusively linked to the murders, DeGrazia was found dead in his ex-girlfriend's home in January 1990, an apparent suicide or victim of foul play. The circumstances of his death remain murky. Kenneth Ponte, a New Bedford attorney with a troubled history of drug use, also attracted police attention. He had represented some of the missing women in legal matters and had personal connections to others. In August 1990, Ponte was indicted for the murder of Rochelle Clifford Dopierala after investigators discovered that she had threatened to expose his drug activities. But the case against him fell apart, and the charges were eventually dismissed. Ponte died alone in his home in 2010, maintaining his innocence to the end. A third suspect, Daniel Tavares Jr., emerged years later after he claimed from prison to have knowledge of the killings. Tavares was already serving time for stabbing his mother to death and would later be convicted of 2 additional murders in Washington state. He led investigators to the body of Gail Botelho, a woman who had disappeared from the Fall River area in 1988, but his connections to the New Bedford victims were never established. The highway killer was never identified, and the case remains open to this day. The families of the 11 victims have spent decades seeking answers, demanding that investigators pursue every lead and utilize every available technology to identify the person who took their loved ones. In recent years, advances in DNA analysis have brought new hope to cold cases across the country. The New Bedford case has been examined using these techniques, and investigators continue to pursue leads. But as of now, the highway killer remains unknown, a shadowy figure who preyed upon the most vulnerable members of society and vanished without ever facing justice. While New Bedford was experiencing its nightmare, another California community was still haunted by the memory of its own serial predator, one who had struck nearly 2 decades earlier. Sonoma County, located in California's wine country north of San Francisco, is known for its scenic beauty, its vineyards, and its mild climate. But in the early 1970s, the county became infamous for something far darker, a series of murders targeting young female hitchhikers that remain unsolved to this day. The era of hitchhiking in America is difficult for younger generations to understand. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, thumbing a ride was a common and generally accepted form of transportation, particularly among young people. The counterculture movement had celebrated the freedom of the open road, and hitchhiking was seen as a way to connect with fellow travelers and experience spontaneous adventure. Public awareness campaigns about the dangers of accepting rides from strangers were still years away. It was in this environment that a killer began to hunt. On February 4th, 1972, two young girls set out for an evening of skating at the Redwood Empire Ice Arena in Santa Rosa. Maureen Sterling was 12 years old. Yvonne Weber was 13. They were best friends, classmates at Herbert Slater Junior High School, who had gotten permission from their parents to attend the skating session together. The girls never made it home. Witnesses later reported seeing them hitchhiking on Guerneville Road, attempting to get a ride back to their neighborhood. A friend who had spoken with them earlier that evening recalled that Maureen and Yvonne had mentioned being approached by a tall, slender man. What happened next remains unknown, but the girls vanished that night and were not seen again for almost a year. On December 28, 1972, their skeletal remains were discovered in a wooded area along France Valley Road, about 10 miles northeast of where they had last been seen. The bodies had been there for months, exposed to the elements and scavenged by animals. The cause of death could not be determined from the remains, but binding materials found at the scene suggested that the girls had been restrained before they died. Less than a month after Maureen and Yvonne disappeared, another young woman vanished under similar circumstances. Kim Wendy Allen was a 19-year-old art student at Santa Rosa Junior College who was known for her trusting nature and her habit of hitchhiking despite warnings from her mother and professors. On March 4th, 1972, she was last seen getting a ride from a car that picked her up in Marin County. Her body was found the same day at the bottom of a steep embankment in Santa Rosa. She had been strangled, her hands bound behind her back with a distinctive type of wire. An oily substance on her body suggested contact with machinery, perhaps from a workshop or garage. Her checkbook was later deposited in a mailbox across from a post office in Kentfield, nearly 3 weeks after her death, apparently by her killer. The murders continued through 1972 and into 1973. Lori Lee Cursa, 13, was found dead in December 1972 with a broken neck. Carolyn Davis, 14, was discovered in July 1973, her body showing signs of strychnine poisoning. Therese Walsh, 23, was found in December 1973, strangled and hogtied with clothesline after attempting to hitchhike from Southern California to visit her family in Northern California. In all, at least 7 women and girls were murdered in Sonoma County between 1972 and 1973. Another woman, Jeanette Kamaheli, disappeared during the same period and has never been found. An unidentified victim discovered in 1979 may also be connected to the series. All of the confirmed victims were young females. All were known or believed to have been hitchhiking when they disappeared, and all were found in remote, rural locations around Santa Rosa. The Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders, as the case came to be known, spawned an intensive investigation, but ultimately produced no arrests. Investigators considered numerous suspects over the years, including the Zodiac Killer, who had been active in the same general region just a few years earlier, and Ted Bundy, who was known to have traveled through Northern California during the early 1970s. The parallels to the Zodiac case were particularly intriguing to investigators. The Zodiac had targeted young couples in remote locations in the Bay Area between 1968 and 1969, and his killings had stopped just as mysteriously as they had begun. The Santa Rosa murders began just a few years later in a region that was geographically close to the Zodiac's hunting grounds. Some investigators wondered whether the same killer had simply shifted his focus to a new type of victim. But the methods were different. The Zodiac had used firearms and knives, and he had taunted police with letters and ciphers. The Santa Rosa killer left no messages, and while the causes of death varied among the victims, there was no consistent weapon or method. The connection, if it existed at all, remained speculative. Ted Bundy presented another tantalizing possibility. Bundy had attended Stanford University in 1968 and was known to have traveled extensively through California in the early 1970s. His preferred method of killing, luring young women into his vehicle before strangling them, matched some of the Santa Rosa cases. After his execution in 1989, Sonoma County authorities publicly identified him as a very serious suspect and attempted to cross-reference his documented movements with the crime timelines. But like the Zodiac theory, the Bundy connection remained unproven. Despite extensive investigation, no definitive evidence linked either notorious killer to the Santa Rosa murders. Other suspects included local individuals with histories of violence against women, but none could be conclusively connected to the crimes. Frederick Manali, a creative writing teacher at Santa Rosa Junior College, came under suspicion due to his proximity to some of the victims and his access to young women. But investigators were unable to gather sufficient evidence to charge him with any of the murders. Neither of these notorious killers was ever definitively linked to the Santa Rosa murders, though both remain persons of interest in various theories about the case. Other suspects included local individuals with histories of violence against women, but none could be conclusively connected to the crimes. The Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders marked the end of an era in more ways than one. The killings contributed to a growing awareness of the dangers of hitchhiking, helping to transform what had once been a carefree expression of youthful freedom into a potentially fatal risk. Public service announcements began warning young people about the dangers of accepting rides from strangers, and hitchhiking gradually fell out of favor. But for the families of the victims, the end of hitchhiking culture provided little comfort. Their daughters and sisters had been taken from them by someone who was never identified, never arrested, never brought to justice. The passage of more than 50 years has not provided the answers they seek, and the Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders remain among California's most haunting unsolved cases. Hawaii is often described as paradise, a tropical haven of swaying palm trees, pristine beaches, and warm breezes that draw millions of tourists every year. But in 1985 and 1986, paradise was shattered by a predator who became known as the Honolulu Strangler. The first victim was Vicki Gale Purdy, a 25-year-old woman from North Carolina who had moved to Hawaii with her husband, an Army helicopter pilot. On the night of May 29, 1985, Vicki went out clubbing in Waikiki and never came home. A taxi driver reported dropping her off at the Shorebird Hotel around midnight, apparently to retrieve her car from the parking lot. The next morning, her body was found at Kihi Lagoon, still wearing the yellow jumpsuit she had worn the night before. Her hands were bound behind her back, and she had been raped and strangled. The murder shocked Honolulu, but it was initially treated as an isolated incident. Vicki Purdy's lifestyle, which included working at a video store that also handled adult materials, suggested to some investigators that her death might have been connected to that business, rather than the work of a random predator. 8 months passed before the killer struck again. On January 14, 1986, 17-year-old Regina Sakamoto missed her bus to school and called her boyfriend to let him know she would be late. She was last seen waiting at a bus stop in the Waipahu area of Oahu. The next day, her body was found near Kihi Lagoon, less than a mile from where Vicky Purdy had been discovered. Like Purdy, Regina's hands were tied behind her back with parachute cord, and she had been raped and strangled. The similarities between the two crimes could no longer be ignored. Police acknowledged that they were likely dealing with a serial killer and formed a task force to coordinate the investigation. But before they could make any progress, the killer struck again. Denise Hughes, a 21-year-old secretary, disappeared on January 30th, 1986, while commuting home from work. Her body was found 2 days later in a drainage canal near Kihi Lagoon, strangled and bound like the others. Louise Medeiros, 25, vanished on March 26th after arriving at Honolulu International Airport on a late-night flight from Kauai. Her decomposing body was discovered a week later near Waikele Stream. The final known victim was Linda Pesci, a 36-year-old woman who disappeared on April 29, 1986, after leaving work. Her car was found abandoned on the side of the Nimitz Highway, and her body was later discovered on Sand Island, bearing the same marks of rape and strangulation that had characterized all the Honolulu Stranglers' victims. The task force investigating the murders profiled the killer as an opportunistic predator who selected his victims based on their vulnerability rather than any specific physical characteristics. All of the women had been alone when they disappeared, often waiting for buses or walking through isolated areas. The use of parachute cord to bind the victims suggested possible military connections, and the locations where the bodies were discovered implied familiarity with Oahu's geography. The profile that emerged was of a local man, probably in his 30s or 40s, who had knowledge of the area and access to vehicles. He likely worked or lived near the areas where the abductions occurred, which would explain how he was able to identify vulnerable targets and transport their bodies without attracting attention. The use of parachute cord raised the possibility of military connections, given the heavy presence of military installations on Oahu. The investigation was complicated by the isolation of Hawaii from the mainland United States. Unlike serial killers who operated in densely populated areas with extensive law enforcement networks, the Honolulu Strangler operated on an island where escape routes were limited, but where forensic resources were also more constrained. Evidence had to be sent to mainland laboratories for analysis, introducing delays that might have been avoided in a major metropolitan area. The psychological impact on Honolulu was severe. The island paradise that had seemed so safe suddenly felt dangerous. Women changed their routines, avoiding bus stops and public transportation wherever possible. Parents drove their daughters to school and work rather than allowing them to travel alone. The laid-back atmosphere that had defined Hawaiian culture was replaced by a wariness that seemed foreign to island life. The media coverage was intense. Local television stations ran nightly updates on the investigation, and newspapers published detailed accounts of each victim's life and death. The coverage served an important purpose, alerting the public to the danger and generating tips for investigators. But it also amplified the fear, creating an atmosphere of siege that persisted long after the killings stopped. Investigators eventually focused on a man named Howard Andrew Gay, a 43-year-old aircraft cargo worker who had relocated to Hawaii from New York. Gay attracted attention after he walked into the Honolulu Police Department claiming that a psychic had told him where to find a body. His tip led police to Linda Pesce's remains on Sand Island, and his detailed knowledge of the crime scene raised immediate suspicions. Gay was arrested on May 9, 1986, and interrogated for hours. A witness placed him with Linda Pesce on the night she disappeared, and his girlfriend told investigators that he had been absent from home on the nights when several of the murders occurred. But when confronted directly with allegations of murder, Gay denied everything. Without physical evidence directly linking him to the crimes, prosecutors felt they could not secure a conviction. Gay was released and eventually returned to the mainland United States. He died in 2003 without ever being charged with the Honolulu Strangler murders. To this day, investigators believe he was responsible for the deaths of all 5 women, but the case was never officially solved. The Honolulu Strangler marked a dark chapter in Hawaii's history, a reminder that even the most idyllic places can harbor the most terrible evil. The investigation transformed the way Honolulu residents thought about their safety, ending an era of casual trust and introducing a wariness that persists to this day. If there is one case that epitomizes the heartbreak of unsolved serial murder, it may be the Oakland County child killer case, a nightmare that terrorized suburban Detroit in the mid-1970s and continues to haunt the families of the victims nearly 50 years later. Oakland County, located just north of Detroit, was a prosperous suburban area in the 1970s, a place where families moved to escape the crime and decay of the inner city. The communities that made up the county, places like Birmingham, Royal Oak, Ferndale, and Berkeley, were considered safe havens, neighborhoods where children could play outside without supervision and where violent crime was virtually unknown. That sense of security was shattered between February 1976 and March 1977. The first confirmed victim was Mark Stebbins, a 12-year-old boy from Ferndale who disappeared on February 15, 1976. Mark had gone to the American Legion Hall with his mother, who worked there as a bartender. Bored, he asked if he could go to a nearby hobby shop. His mother refused, telling him he had already spent his allowance. Mark left anyway, and no one saw him alive again. 4 days later, Mark's body was found in a parking lot in Southfield. He was fully clothed and appeared to have been bathed before being placed in the lot. An autopsy revealed that he had been sexually assaulted and then smothered to death. The careful washing of the body and the public placement of the remains suggested a killer who was methodical, almost ritualistic in his behavior. For nearly a year, no more children were taken. Then, on December 22, 1976, 12-year-old Jill Robinson left her home in Royal Oak after an argument with her mother about dinner preparations. She grabbed her bicycle and rode off, intending to return once she had calmed down. She never came back. Jill's body was found on December 26th, lying along Interstate 75 in Troy, within sight of the Troy police station. She had been shot in the face with a 12-gauge shotgun. Like Mark Stebbins, she had been bathed and her clothes had been laundered before her body was placed where it would be easily discovered. Unlike Mark, there was no evidence of sexual assault. Less than a week later, on January 2, 1977, 10-year-old Christine Mihalik disappeared while walking home from a 7-Eleven store in Berkeley. She had gone to buy a magazine and never returned. Her body was found 19 days later on a snowbank in Franklin Village. She had been smothered to death, and like the other victims, her body had been cleaned before being left in a public place. By now, police recognized that they were dealing with a serial killer who was targeting children in Oakland County. A massive task force was formed, drawing resources from multiple police departments, the FBI, and other agencies. The investigation became the largest in Michigan history, generating tens of thousands of tips and leads. But the killer was not finished. Timothy King, 11 years old, was the fourth and final confirmed victim. On March 16, 1977, Tim borrowed 30 cents from his sister to buy candy at a drugstore near his home in Birmingham. He was seen walking toward the store with his skateboard and was never seen alive again. 6 days later, Tim's body was found in a ditch in Livonia, a suburb on the western edge of Oakland County. He had been sexually assaulted and smothered, his body cleaned and dressed in clean clothes before being placed where it would be found. His skateboard was nearby. Tim King's murder sparked an unprecedented response. His father, Barry King, was a prominent attorney who would spend the rest of his life seeking justice for his son. His mother had written a letter to the killer while Tim was missing, pleading for his safe return and mentioning that his favorite food was Kentucky Fried Chicken. When Tim's body was recovered, an autopsy revealed that his last meal had been fried chicken, suggesting that the killer had read the letter and fed the boy his favorite food before killing him. This detail chilled investigators and the public alike. The killer was not merely snatching children off the streets. He was following the news coverage, reading the desperate pleas of grieving parents, and incorporating those details into his crimes. It suggested a level of cruelty and psychological manipulation that went beyond ordinary predation. The community response to the Oakland County child killings was immediate and overwhelming. Parents who had allowed their children to play freely in suburban neighborhoods now kept them under constant supervision. Schools implemented new safety protocols, requiring adults to sign children in and out. Neighborhood watch groups formed seemingly overnight, with volunteers patrolling streets and scrutinizing anyone who seemed out of place. The investigation itself became the largest in Michigan history. More than 18,000 tips poured in from concerned citizens. Hundreds of suspects were investigated, some multiple times. Polygraph examinations were administered by the dozens. The FBI provided profiling assistance, developing theories about the killer's background and motivations that guided the investigation. But despite these efforts, the Oakland County child killer remained at large. The methodical nature of the crimes, particularly the washing of bodies and laundering of clothes, suggested someone who was organized and careful. The fact that no witnesses came forward, despite the populated areas where the children were taken, suggested someone who appeared trustworthy, perhaps even authoritative. Some investigators believed the killer might be impersonating a police officer, using a badge or uniform to gain the trust of his young victims. Others theorized that he might be connected to a larger network of predators, possibly involving wealthy individuals who were being protected by their connections. The Oakland County child killer case, also known as the babysitter killer due to the care the murderer seemed to take of his victims before killing them, has generated countless theories and suspects over the decades. One name that has surfaced repeatedly is Christopher Bush, a convicted pedophile from a wealthy local family who was questioned about the murders in 1977. A drawing found in Bush's home after his 1978 suicide bore an unsettling resemblance to Timothy King, and other evidence suggested he may have had knowledge of or involvement in the crimes. But DNA testing conducted years later failed to link Bush directly to the murders. Other suspects have included James Vincent Gunnels, an associate of Bush's, convicted serial killer John Wayne Gacy, who was known to have visited Michigan during the relevant time period, and various other individuals whose names have surfaced over the years. None has ever been charged. Barry King continued to investigate his son's murder until his death in 2023, publishing findings and pressing authorities to pursue leads that he believed had been overlooked. His daughter Kathy has continued the family's quest for answers, filing lawsuits to obtain documents that she believes may shed light on the case. As of today, the Oakland County child killer remains unidentified. DNA evidence recovered from some of the victims has been profiled, but does not match anyone in law enforcement databases. The case stands as a painful reminder that even the most intensive investigations can fail to produce justice, and that some wounds never heal. In the desert Southwest, in the shadow of the Sandia Mountains, lies the city of Albuquerque, New Mexico, a place of striking beauty and rich cultural history. It is also a place where, in the early 2000s, a serial killer buried at least 11 women and girls in the shifting sands of the West Mesa. The West Mesa is an expanse of undeveloped land on the western edge of Albuquerque, a stark landscape of arroyos and scrubland that stretches towards the Rio Puerco. In the early 2000s, it was still largely untouched by development, a place where the city's homeless population sometimes camped and where teenagers went to ride dirt bikes and ATVs. It was also, investigators would later discover, a burial ground. The first hint that something terrible had happened on the West Mesa came on February 2, 2009, when a woman named Christine Ross took her dog for a walk along a dry wash. Her dog, Ruka, ran ahead and began digging in the sand. When Ross caught up to see what had attracted the animal's attention, she found a bone protruding from the earth. Unsure whether it was human, she took a photo and texted it to her sister, a nurse. The reply came back quickly. It was a human femur. Ross called the Albuquerque Police Department, and within hours, officers were swarming the area. What they found was beyond anything they had anticipated. The West Mesa was a graveyard, and someone had been using it to dispose of murder victims for years. Over the next several months, investigators sifted through more than 40,000 cubic yards of dirt, methodically excavating the burial site. They recovered the remains of 11 women and girls, along with one unborn child. Most of the victims had been missing for years, their disappearances largely unreported or attributed to their transient lifestyles. The victims ranged in age from 15 to 32. Almost all had connections to drug addiction and prostitution, having worked the streets of Albuquerque's East Central Avenue, a notorious corridor of motels, bars, and drug houses where sex workers were known to ply their trade. They were the kind of victims that society often overlooks, women and girls whose absence went unnoticed because their lives had already pushed them to the margins. But these women were more than the circumstances of their deaths. They were daughters, sisters, mothers, friends. Michelle Valdez, who was 4 months pregnant when she was killed, had a young daughter who would grow up without her mother. Doreen Marquez had 2 children who would never see her again. Julie Nieto left behind a son, and her sister Valerie was so devastated by her disappearance that she fell into a deep depression from which she never recovered. Jamie Barella, at 15 the youngest victim, had been at a family gathering with her cousin Evelyn Salazar when they decided to walk to a nearby park. Neither of them came home. Their bodies were found buried together, 2 young women whose lives were cut short before they had really begun. The families of the victims had known for years that something was wrong. They had reported their loved ones missing, had posted flyers and organized searches, had called the police repeatedly to demand updates on investigations that seemed to go nowhere. But without bodies, without evidence, without witnesses, there was little that could be done. The discovery of the burial ground validated their worst fears, while simultaneously providing a grim kind of closure. Now they knew what had happened to their daughters and sisters. Now they could lay them to rest. But the knowledge brought little comfort when the person responsible remained at large. Detective Ida Lopez, who had been tracking missing women in Albuquerque for years, recognized many of the victims from her files. She had been warning anyone who would listen that something was happening to the city's most vulnerable women, but her concerns had largely fallen on deaf ears. Now, with 11 bodies in the ground, her worst fears had been confirmed. The impact on Albuquerque's sex worker community was profound. Women who worked the streets had always known they faced risks, but the West Mesa discovery made those risks terrifyingly concrete. Organizations like Safe Streets New Mexico were founded in response to the murders, creating systems to track sex workers and alert the public if they went missing. The hope was that if another predator emerged, the early warning systems would prevent a similar tragedy. The investigation into what became known as the West Mesa murders was massive and frustrating. Satellite images from the early 2000s showed tire tracks leading to the burial site, evidence that the killer had driven to the area multiple times to dispose of bodies. But by 2009, those tracks had long since been obliterated by wind and weather. Investigators identified several suspects, but were unable to build a case against any of them. Lorenzo Montoya, a local man with a history of picking up prostitutes and a violent criminal record, lived less than 3 miles from the burial site. In 2006, Montoya had murdered a teenage sex worker in his trailer, strangling her with a cord before being shot and killed by the girl's boyfriend. Some investigators believed he was the most likely suspect in the West Mesa murders, but his death meant he could never be questioned. Joseph Blee, nicknamed the mid-school rapist for his history of sexually assaulting teenage girls near a local middle school, was another suspect. Blee was a serial predator who had frequented the same areas where the West Mesa victims had worked. He is currently serving a lengthy prison sentence for rape, but no conclusive evidence has linked him to the murders. Other suspects have been investigated and cleared, including a Missouri photographer who had attended the New Mexico State Fair, where some of the victims may have been targeted, and a convicted Colorado serial killer who claimed knowledge of the murders but later denied involvement. The West Mesa bone collector, as the killer came to be known, has never been identified. The case remains open, and a $100,000 reward is still being offered for information leading to an arrest and conviction. But with each passing year, the trail grows colder, and the likelihood of solving the case diminishes. What happened on the West Mesa is a tragedy on multiple levels. 11 women and girls lost their lives at the hands of a killer who preyed upon the most vulnerable members of society. Their deaths went unnoticed for years because the systems meant to protect them had failed, and the person responsible may never be brought to justice. The stories you have heard tonight span more than a century and reach across the breadth of America, from the cotton fields of Texas to the volcanic beaches of Hawaii, from the industrial heartland of Ohio to the sun-baked desert of New Mexico. They are stories of communities terrorized by predators who emerged from the shadows to kill and then vanished without a trace. Some of these cases may eventually be solved. Advances in DNA technology and genetic genealogy have brought closure to families who waited decades for answers, and cold case investigators continue to pursue leads in cases that once seemed hopeless. But for many of the victims and their families, justice may never come. The killers have escaped, whether to other crimes, to prison for unrelated offenses, or to death itself. What remains is memory, the memory of lives cut short, of communities transformed by fear, and of questions that may never be answered. We tell these stories not to glorify violence, but to honor the victims who deserve to be remembered, and to remind ourselves that even in the darkest corners of human experience, there are people who refuse to forget. These cases span different eras, different regions, and different circumstances, but they share common threads that speak to the nature of serial predation. The killers often targeted vulnerable populations, young couples seeking privacy, women who worked on the margins of society, children who trusted the wrong adult. They operated in the shadows, striking when their victims were most exposed and disappearing before anyone could raise an alarm. The communities they terrorized were forever changed by their crimes. In Texarkana, residents still remember the summer of 1946, when no one felt safe after dark. In Oakland County, parents still hesitate before letting their children walk alone to school. In Albuquerque, sex workers still look over their shoulders when they climb into unfamiliar cars. The killers may be gone, whether through death or imprisonment for other crimes, or simply through the passage of time, but their legacy of fear persists. For the families of the victims, the passage of decades brings little comfort. They have spent lifetimes seeking answers that may never come, pursuing justice that remains forever out of reach. Some have become advocates, pushing for changes in law enforcement practices and victims' rights. Others have retreated into private grief, unable to bear the weight of endless searching. All have been marked by loss in ways that outsiders can scarcely imagine. The investigations themselves offer lessons about the limitations of law enforcement and the challenges of catching serial killers. Before the advent of DNA analysis and computerized databases, investigators relied on witness testimony, physical evidence, and intuition. When witnesses were scarce and evidence was minimal, as it often was in these cases, even the most dedicated detectives could make little progress. Modern forensic techniques have brought closure to some cold cases, identifying killers decades after their crimes through genetic genealogy and advanced DNA analysis. The Colonial Parkway case saw a breakthrough in 2024 when DNA linked one suspect to some of the murders. Similar techniques continue to be applied to other unsolved cases, offering hope that answers may yet be found. But for many of these cases, the window for justice has closed. The Phantom Killer, if he was not Ewell Swinney, has almost certainly died of old age. The Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, if he was not Francis Sweeney, has been dead for decades. The Servant Girl Annihilator killed his victims nearly 140 years ago. Whatever secrets these killers possessed, they took them to their graves. What we are left with are the stories, accounts of terror and loss, of communities united by fear and determined to protect their own. These stories deserve to be told, not to sensationalize violence, but to honor those who were taken and to remind ourselves that evil can visit even the most peaceful places. Thank you for joining me tonight. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue to bring you these stories of unexplained mysteries. Until next time, sleep well, and remember that sometimes the most terrifying stories are the ones that are true.